IVM.
This is Storytellers and Story Sellers with Vineet on the IVM Podcast Network. And today, we're joined by my boss. Is he my boss? He should be my boss. He's everybody's boss at IVM. Please say hello to Ranjeet Pratap Singh, CEO of Pratilipi, the company that's recently acquired IVM Podcasts and is doing some fantastic work in native language storytelling in India. Hi, Ranjeet. Great to have you on the show.
Hi, Vineet. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to clarify to your listeners, Pratilipi is very, very flat in general. So I'm not really anybody's boss, but a pleasure to be here.
It's just adding flavor to the story, isn't it? But interestingly speaking, my actual boss also does a podcast on your network. So that's a full circle there. Pleasure to have you here, man. I have read and heard so much about Pratilipi and the kind of work that you guys are doing. I think, what's it been now? 7 years that you've been in existence? Seven years and a little more?
About 6 years.
About 6 years, yeah. Without much ado, tell us about Pratilipi, man. It's India's largest literature UGC platform, if I'm understanding that correctly. But tell us what that really means. Tell us how you are taking India's native language internet storytelling forward, making a platform. I'd love to, be explained to like I'm 5 years old. What does Pratilipi do?
So the way we think about Pratilipi essentially is that Pratilipi is an Indian language storytelling platform, at least for the moment. The basic premise is that we want to essentially build products and platforms where people can come and share their stories with each other in multiple different formats, multiple different languages, multiple different geographies, and everything else. So obviously what Pratilipi is known for is our literature product, which is called Pratilipi, where people come and publish their stories, novels, books, essays, stuff like that, and other people come and read that. But as I was saying, we see ourselves as a storytelling platform, and literature is a part of it, which is why we have recently launched Pratilipi Comics, then Pratilipi FM, and now IVM Podcast. So the basic understanding is that if you have a story that you want to share with the rest of the world, you should be able to do that irrespective of any barriers as far as possible.
Fantastic, man. I know that around the world, publishing platforms have always been sort of lifeblood of the internet, right? Like when I started my journey with the internet, I know Blogger was one of the first things that I went to, right? WordPress was a big thing as well. Globally, there have been a lot of these platforms, right? And they've evolved in different ways. Some have gone the community publishing way. Some have gone just writer support with Wattpad and stuff. Then there's Substack, which allows you to publish and monetize differently, right? Tell us how Pratilipi stands out, right? What makes it different? What makes it so uniquely Indian? And I think you've got, I would say, 50,000 published authors on the platform now. Is that a number? Maybe more?
Actually, now more than 300,000 writers.
Wow, that's insane, right? 300,000 writers all on one platform. I'd say Substack will have difficulty matching those numbers at this point. But tell us how it's different. What sets it apart?
Before that, actually, you kind of named some of my favorite founders. Blogger was built by a guy called Ev Williams. Right. He also built Twitter later on. I personally think that Ev is one of the best product guys of our generation,
right?
Especially as far as consumer products go. Also a big fan of Ellen at Wattpad. So broadly speaking, to be fair, I think Blogger was a revolution, just like WordPress. It's just that they were built in a long time back in a different era where they focused largely on the tools and the technology, and they did not really address discovery very well. So if you write a blog on Blogger or WordPress, the technology is absolutely fantastic, especially considering a lot of it was actually built a long time back. It's just that you don't really build any distribution on top of it.
Right.
Our thesis behind building Pratilipi was that the best writers should only focus on their craft, and everything else, including distribution, should be kind of taken care of by the platform itself.
Right.
So that is broadly what is different, and that's probably just it. Similar to, I think, Wattpad is quite similar as far as our literature platform is concerned as well. The only real difference is that Wattpad kind of is concentrated into a few genres.
Right.
Most importantly, teen romance. We, on the other hand, have been taking a lot more horizontal approach, both in terms of newer products like comics and FM and IVM, but also in terms of genres and categories that we have on Pratilipi itself.
Right.
So we will have a lot of niche genres like historical fiction, science fiction. We have actually books on education. We have a book on quantum mechanics in Malayalam. We have writers who are used to work at World Bank and now they write about economics or healthcare. So we have consciously taken a lot more horizontal approach in terms of the kind of content that we have, the kind of writers we have. I think that's the major difference. Otherwise, it's not like we are building something which is really hard. It's not really rocket science. It's just a community or a platform for people to kind of come together and share their stories with each other.
I love the humility with which you said we're not doing something out there. But nobody else did it. So it is something out there. I mean, at least the way I see it, right? And before I go into asking you about the history of the platform, right? Just explain to us what happens when a writer signs up for Pratilipi. How's that sort of onboarding process like, or what are the thought processes when you are going out onboard people? What happens and what are the possibilities if someone signs up for Pratilipi?
Before that, I think the best proof of how Pratilipi is working right now is probably that we don't really onboard writers. Right. So 90% of our new writers are people who are readers on Pratilipi. They read like 50 or 100 stories. And then they thought that, you know what, I also had a story that I wanted to share with the rest of the world. And because I have read so many stories, let me also share my own story with the rest of the world.
Right.
So a vast majority of these new writers are already familiar with how the product works and like how do you get more readers, how do you get reviews, what you need to do, what you cannot do, and things like that. So generally the way it would work is that you will register on the platform and just you will go to a writer panel and you will start publishing, and that's probably just it. If you want, you can add extra tags. If you want, you can add your genre and categories and things like that. You can add a cover image, you can add a summary. But none of this is mandatory. So you don't really have to do any of it.
Right.
If you just want to publish a story, just go and publish a story and that's it. In fact, our vision largely, and I would not say we are there yet, but our vision has been that it should be as easy as if you were publishing or rather sending a message on WhatsApp or Facebook.
Right.
So that's kind of like the end goal of how simple we think it should be. Once you publish a content, then basically you will share it with some of your own friends and family and stuff like that. And our algorithms will kind of detect reading behavior from them and then try to recommend the content to people who have a similar reading behavior with that.
Right.
And that's basically just how the process works.
That's beautiful and beautifully simple as well. One quick question before I jump into the history of it. It's not a monetized platform for writers yet. Publishing, does it pay you or that's still something that you're building out?
So two parts. One part we have actually started about 4 or 5 months back. So for the best of the best stories, we essentially buy the IP rights with the writers.
Right.
So the way it works is that we give them some upfront payment, and as and when Pratilipi monetizes, they get a share of that revenue as royalty.
Beautiful.
Right. So that is something that we have just started. Something that we are just going to be launching this month, and then the next iteration next month is essentially that now readers can support their favorite creators in 2 different ways. One is that readers can subscribe to their favorite creators and they get access to some exclusive content, some exclusive features on the product and things like that. And second, even if they don't want to subscribe to a creator, they can give them virtual gifts as stickers
right.
to show their appreciation.
Right.
So both of these ways, writers will kind of make money from readers directly.
Well, that's brilliant. I think monetization is the next rev for creators in India, right? I think apart from YouTube, maybe nobody else really has like a proper handle on monetization. And I know that YouTube monetization is also often not enough for a lot of creators, but it's great that you're already on that product journey to start monetizing better. Let me ask you this then. Let's just dial back the clock a little bit and tell us how Pratilipi started, man. I'll set this up for you so you don't have to repeat something you've said in many interviews. You're from a small village in UP.
Right.
And one of the few literate people in that village, people who could read and write. And you're also a voracious reader who then went to FMS and then worked at Vodafone for a bit, right? And that's where the whole Pratilipi idea was swirling in your mind. And again, I know this because I've just sat down to listen to a bunch of your interviews. So tell us how this really happened at that point in time. There's so much opportunity that you're seeing. You're a reader who's not able to break through and get access to newer audiences. And again, we're talking about mid-2000s, the first decade or so. So tell us about how the history of this company happened, right? And I'd love for you to get started at the point where you're already at Vodafone, you have so much exposure, you know what is possible to do. How did you go from there to finally having a company founded with your founders? I'd love to know that journey.
Sure. Just to be clear, one kind of correction. So it's not that I am the first literate. It's more like I'm one of the few English literates.
Yeah. That's what I meant. I'm sorry.
My mom takes a lot of pride in the fact that she was class 12th pass at the time when most girls were not.
Right.
So I wouldn't want to kind of disappoint her by saying that she's not literate.
Oh, no, absolutely. And big ups to your mom about that.
Yeah. So especially given that my father failed in class 8, so my mom takes a lot of pride in the fact that she actually passed class 12.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So yeah. So I have been facing this problem as like one individual or as a person that I couldn't find enough content to read when I kind of started my engineering. So I did not want to solve this problem. I wanted somebody else to solve this problem, primarily because I always thought that my biggest strength is more in terms of problem solving and less in terms of technology or product. So even if and when I would have started a company, my thought process was that I should build something more like consumer ops or like software as a service company, not a media technology company or a consumer internet company. So like when I was in Vodafone, my last stint was in Ahmedabad, and I was coincidentally given an area which was both the second largest for Vodafone, but also one of the few areas in Gujarat, probably the only area in Gujarat where we were actually not the market leader. So in Gujarat, Vodafone has a very, very strong hold. And in telecom, it's like almost probably the only circle or only area where a telecom company actually had more than 40% EBITDA.
Oh, wow.
But like Ahmedabad was not really part of it. So my territory was always either the worst or the second worst for 15 years. And then like I joined with the help of my team, obviously. We were able to do kind of really well. We were the best team 2 out of the last 3 quarters, 2 of the last 3 months, and the second best team in the 3rd month. So at that point, I started thinking that, this now seems a little too comfortable. If I'm already kind of reaching at number 1, number 2, then basically where do I go from here? And this seems a little too easy. So there were also some auxiliary factors, but this became the primary factor that I thought that when you are young, you can work harder than most people. You don't really have any immediate money needs, or at least not that many. So you can take more risk. So I wanted to basically do something which is a little bit more challenging, which forces me to kind of do things which I'm uncomfortable with, and also help me grow at a faster pace.
And this was when you were 25, 24, 25, something like that?
I think 24, 25. Yeah.
Sure.
So I quit my job at the time. I hadn't really decided what to do. Most people did not really believe that, you would be quitting a corporate career coming from my background, where you're paid quite a bit, you're at the top of your game, you're getting a lot of bonuses and variable pay and all of that without really having a plan.
Right.
But my plan essentially was that like I'm still so young that I can take a lot of risk. Even if nothing else works out, maybe after 6 months or a year, I can join back corporate. Worst case, I'll be paid a little bit lesser. It's not really that big a deal. So the first thing that I did after quitting was essentially like take some time off to go and stay with my friends, and then just try and reach out to different founders and like see if I like one of them enough to basically beg them for a job. So I had a comm science degree, then MBA. I have worked in retail, channel sales, marketing, and a bunch of different domains. So the thesis was that I can do like different kind of work, and it's not really that there is a particular profile that I'm looking for.
Right.
And I always prided myself on the amount of work that I could do, so that was not a problem either. So I met a bunch of founders. I liked some of them, but did not like anybody enough to say that like give me a job. So I was still kind of deciding that. My last pit stop was in Bangalore, where to make ends meet, I was also teaching for people to train them for CAT, which is the MBA entrance examination.
Right.
And around this time, like I was talking to some of my friends who knew that I had this problem. They basically said that like you have been trying to find out what to do. And this is a problem that you have been saying that you want somebody else to solve, and nobody else is solving this, which should mean that it is hard and challenging, which is what you are looking for. So why don't you kind of give it a shot? And I thought that kind of makes sense. Subsequently, these are the people that I reached out to join as the early team members as well, because they had already seen this problem, or at least me talking about this problem. So it was easier for them to understand that I'm not just doing it as a flash in the pan, and I really want to solve this problem. So these people basically became my co-founders as well as my early employees. And that's how Pratilipi kind of started.
That's beautiful, man. I think discovering that the problem you want to solve is already a problem that you have felt personally for so long. I think that's a beautiful moment right there. Let me ask you this, right? And around this time when you're forming your team, you got like a core bunch of people that you trust, that you want to work with together. It's still just the founding of a company, right? There's still a lot more that needs to happen there, right? Can you talk us through how you went about prioritizing? Where I'm coming from on this is, it's a huge problem to solve, right? Native language marketplaces or native language content marketplaces. You can build 36 of them in India because there are so many languages in so many states and so many people. How did you prioritize, right? What you were going to go after? And a sort of allied question, when you did prioritize this and you were going to sort of look for funding or let's stick with the prioritization first. I'll come to funding in a second. But how did you prioritize? Right? It's a huge problem. So many languages, so many people, supply, demand, not there. How did you prioritize?
Right. So just to kind of start off with a fact, I am kind of like a hyper-rational person in general.
Right.
So I kind of think in terms of probability.
Right.
Most of the founders, at least the way Silicon Valley kind of romanticizes founders, founders generally seem like a very, very binary people who are either like 100% optimistic or 0% optimistic.
Right.
Whether this works or this doesn't work. I have always been very probabilistic in nature. So the way I thought of Pratilipi at that time largely was that, what is the highest probability thing that I can kind of pursue so that if it doesn't work, I know faster. And if it does work, then it has compounding returns instead of having one-time returns.
Right.
So with that in mind, and obviously I was also careful about what are my strength areas, both as a person and as a team, of a market or a problem statement where we can actually do a better job than rest of the people.
Right.
So the first thing that I did essentially was just talk to a lot of authors and try and understand what the problem statement really is. Because I only had insights into the problem statement from a reader's perspective,
right.
and even that from a single person reader's perspective. So I personally met about 350 odd authors and spoke to about under 100 authors on phone to try and understand just their perspective. And I was not really asking any specific questions. I was just asking open-ended questions to try and understand where they stood, what are the problems they were facing, what are the opportunities set according to them.
What profile of authors were you speaking to at this point?
So mostly what I did was that my uncle, my father's elder brother, is a writer.
Right.
So what I did was that we organized a poetry event in Raebareli, which is my hometown.
Right.
And basically whoever came there, I spoke to them and then I asked them to kind of refer to some of their own friends.
Beautiful.
So essentially I spoke to people who would kind of spend some time with me.
Brilliant. And what a lovely lead generation event. A poetry thing. This is fantastic. Please go on.
So that's how I kind of understood a little bit more about the problem statement. Then I was already a big fan of Ev and Alan, as I was saying. So I kind of tried to learn from their both like good decisions and bad decisions. So one of the things, for example, we realized was that, we don't really know the timing. We don't know when this is going to work. And we don't really know business model in terms of like how monetization is going to be figured out. Primarily because neither Blogger nor Wattpad had really figured out monetization at that particular point in time.
Right.
So we thought that literature seems like a good idea because literature is both broad, where there are a lot of different verticals, a lot of different genres, and deep because like trade or fiction would usually be somewhere between 40% to 70% of any given market or any given country in terms of total reading market or total book market. So we thought let's start with literature. Within literature, we thought let's start with text because you have to understand this was in 2014 and when there was no geo and data connectivity, it was still hard. So essentially we thought like what is the easiest way for people to create and consume content, and text seemed like the right way to go. So we focused on literature, we focused on text, and we learned from Wattpad that we don't want to be too niche. So we, from the initial days itself, we basically said that, okay, we will have multiple genres, but we'll have only few languages. So we started with Hindi and Gujarati, primarily because I knew Hindi and one of my co-founders knew Gujarati. So it was easier for us to talk to writers and to readers to solve their problems and their queries. And then we launched Tamil within 3-4 months because two reasons. One of my co-founders knew Tamil. And second, because we also wanted to see that whether like North Indian languages versus South Indian languages, was there a major difference in terms of how their readers and writers thought and behaved. So these are the 3 languages that we started off with. So that's how the initial prioritization kind of came along. And because of our learning around that we did not know which model will work, we made sure that we kind of kept the product very simple and we kept our burn rate very, very low because we wanted to be sure that whenever we are able to figure out the business model as well as the core value proposition, we would not be running out of money at that time. We would survive till the time that happens.
Right.
So we kept ourselves very, very lean and very, very focused on just providing the right sort of reader and writer experience instead of worrying about anything else.
I have 2 follow-ups to what you just said, but before that, you started with Hindi, Gujarati, Tamil. What are the languages that are growing fastest now? I think now you're in 14 languages?
For the core product, for the literature product, we have 12 languages now.
12 languages. Right. And what are the languages that are growing fastest? Right. I'm sure the bulk of the publishing happens in Hindi, Gujarati, Tamil, Bengali, I'm guessing. But what's growing fast for you?
So among the older languages, like the ones that we launched more than 3 years back, the fastest growing languages are Malayalam, Bengali, and Marathi.
Right.
In the newer languages, Odia is the language that is growing the fastest.
Oh, that's very interesting. Odia literature is on the horizon.
Also, caveat that it's the newer language. We only launched it about a year back, so the base is relatively smaller.
Right. Got it. So 2 follow-ups to what you talked about earlier, right? One is from a supply perspective. The other is from a metrics perspective. Which one would you prefer first? I'll go supply first, right?
Sure.
New writers being onboarded, right? For a product that's just been conceptualized. I'm sure you and I can sit and talk about a Wattpad or a Substack, but pretty sure that people who are reading Parsai probably don't know these products, right? How did you pitch
Right.
Pratilipi to them? What was your pitch to these early writers or to the first set of people to come on board?
It was really, really hard, to be honest, because for any kind of marketplace, including a UGC platform, generally it kind of follows the chicken egg problem that if you don't have readers, how do you get writers? And if you don't have writers, how do you get readers?
Right.
So the thing that we did to kind of cross that was that we reached out to the people that we had already spoken with to understand the market statement. Funnily enough, and a little sadly enough, most of these people still said no, because their thought process was that why would I spend time and energy on something where nobody is going to read it?
Right.
A lot of people also thought that, we have been doing this for 30 years and you're just starting this. Why do you think that you would be able to do anything better than what we have already done? So what we proposed to them was that, which is a fair argument. So let us do this. All you have to do is give us your approval and say yes, that we can make your profile and we can publish your content and things like that. You don't have to spend any time, any energy into anything.
Right.
So we basically made their accounts. We uploaded their content. If there was any review or any comment that people wrote to their stories, we essentially shared that on WhatsApp to these people or Facebook Messenger to these people. So that is how we basically said that, okay, we will take away your downside. So your real downside was in terms of time that you have to spend. So there is no downside anymore. Everything will be handled by us super manually, but we will do it very, very promptly, very, very respectfully. And if people come and read that, that is what you wanted. And if people don't read that, all you had to do was basically say yes, and that's
right.
it. There was no other downside for it.
Right.
So that is how we got our initial 150 to 200 writers.
Well, that's a great way of just lowering the entry barrier, and
right.
while you also discover what the platform is all about and what it can do, it just gets you high quality supply. Let me ask you my second question, which is about metrics. Right? In those early days, what were the metrics that you would consider for success? Right? Again, for my listeners, I want to give you perspective that no other product like this existed at that time, right? You couldn't, for e-commerce, you would always be like, okay, GMV or any other metrics that you can measure and benchmark against others. But for a product that has, at that time at least, no real competition, what were the metrics that you were looking at?
So just to be clear, it's not like we were the first company building this or first team trying to solve this. So there were some people. It's just that all of those were very, very small.
Right.
And some of those were just trying to do too many things, which in our opinion is very, very hard to do if you want to reach a large scale.
Right.
Having said that, the way we think about our key matrices has been what is the leading indicator to tell us that we are moving in the right direction.
Right.
So we basically, in fact, funnily enough, our leading matrices or what we call our North Stars have basically remained the same from, I think, the first month till even today. So we had two North Star matrices. One was stories read. So that will basically count only if somebody has read the entirety of a story.
Right.
So if you read 5 lines of a story and kind of go away, that doesn't count as stories read. And new stories published. So the premise was basically if new stories are being published more, that essentially means that we are providing value to our writers.
Right.
And if more stories are being read, that means we are providing value to our readers.
Absolutely.
And then we had two other matrices to make sure that we were achieving these two North Stars in the right manner possible. So from very, very early on, we focused a lot on our net promoter score, which is basically what percentage of your users actually like your product, and completion rate, which basically means that if you started reading a story, what is the percentage probability that you are going to completely read?
Right.
So these are the 4 matrices that we care about the most. I think from at least month 0, if not day 0. And those are the matrices that we care the most about even today.
That's brilliant. I mean, rarely do you hear such sort of consistency in metrics that you're chasing over 6 years now. Let me pivot this over and ask you a couple of things about new things that you're doing right now, right? You talked about comics and audio being 2 new sort of focus areas for you, right? Let me start with comics. And before we talk about your Pratilipi's take on comics, tell us your relationship with comics. I heard you talk about this in interview somewhere that's where you started reading, right?
Right. I think it's not just probably for me, it's probably true for a vast majority of people who read a lot today.
Absolutely.
The way they start reading is by reading comics. In fact, if you have seen any science-related sitcoms, let's say a Big Bang Theory, for example, you would see that like the best scientists or the best brains of today, most of them are still big fans of comics.
Absolutely.
So I think comics are great for 2 different purposes. Number one is obviously that they inculcate that reading habit, which essentially means that today you might start by reading comics, but tomorrow you are going to read a lot more deeper stuff, which will help you grow as a person as well as a professional.
Right.
The second thing is also that comics give you like hope and dreams, which help you kind of go through a bad time. So if you are, for example, being bullied at school, or if you don't have enough money, so you feel poor, comics act as one of the greatest escape mechanisms that humans have seen.
Right.
And like that, I think is absolutely brilliant for a growing child and a growing mind. At least that's on my take on comics, that comics are really, really important cultural artifact for any generation in any culture.
That's beautiful. And I think I agree completely, right? I've been a big comics fan myself. We used to sit around, like even as recently as my time at TVF, we would sit around and wonder if we can do, throw in a Doga joke somewhere, or, just, it's one of those things that stays with you, right? And Indian comics specifically, right? With the internet coming through, web comics have become a big sort of genre online, right? And I mean, there are Indian webcomic guys who are publishing on Instagram, and then there are more sort of established comic collectives that are publishing on their own platforms. What are you guys doing about it? I mean, how is Pratilipi getting into comics?
So our thesis largely for comics is very similar to our thesis for Pratilipi's literature product, which is essentially that over a period of time, we want to basically be the player where anybody who wants to share their story via comics to the rest of the world, they should be able to do that.
Right.
And we will have multiple formats within comics as well. So right now, for example, what we have done is that we have licensed some stories from global players. For example, let's say Tapas. We have licensed some stories or comics from like the old legacy comic companies in India, including Amar Chitra Katha and Diamond Comics, which publishes Taj Chaudhary, Billu, Pinky, stuff like that. We have partnered with new age comic publishers, including, for example, TBS Planet, Graphic India. And we have comics from freelancers as well as comics from our own Pratilipi stories, which people can come and read on the platform. We started kind of Pratilipi comics, I think, less than a year back. And I think in February, we should have 1 million people reading comics every month.
That's fantastic.
So I think in less than a year or year and a half, we would probably be the largest comic player in terms of actual unique readers. And I think like that is still barely the beginning. So at the peak of comics popularity in India, late 90s, we had, for example, a new comic, especially if it featured Nagraj or Super Commando Dhruv from Raj Comics, it will sometimes sell over 1 million copies.
Right.
Now that number is actually less than like 40 to 50,000.
Wow.
So we want to get to a point where that number goes back to 1 million and then hopefully from there to 10 million. So that's essentially what we are trying to do. And more importantly, that like instead of just having publishing houses publish comics, and hopefully that will also happen, that we will have like hundreds of publishing houses and studios, but hopefully we'll also have a lot of younger people doing it as just a fun hobby, where you just want to create comics for fun.
Right.
Or you just want to do it as your own way of escape mechanism. Or you want to do it to build your own personal brand. Or you want to do it as a career. So hopefully we'll build a platform where all of these possibilities become real. At least that's the dream behind Pratilipi Comics.
And that's a totally worthy dream. Again, 2 follow-ups to what you just said. One is the way that you need to bring people together to create a comic is very different from self-publishing literature, right? Like comics require, you'll need an artist, a colorist, someone to do script and writing, all of that, right? Have you retooled the marketplace a little bit to fit in the way comics operate, or has it been like a natural fit to what you were doing earlier? Just want to get your sense from a product perspective, maybe. So
the honest answer is we are still figuring it out.
Sure.
So right now, because of exactly the reason that you said, that book writing can still be a single endeavor.
Right.
So in general, even for books, you will have an editor and a cover designer and all of that.
Sure.
But like 95% of the work in a book writing is basically lies with the writer.
Right.
Which means that like even if there isn't a good editor or a good cover designer or whatever, it's still okay. At least it can work. In comics, it simply cannot. Like at the very least, you need an illustrator and you need a story writer.
Right.
But sometimes you also need somebody else to do lettering and coloring and a bunch of other stuff.
Absolutely.
So we are still figuring out what is the best way around. The second problem statement here also is that different comic artists actually have their own preferred tools.
Right.
So some people are already used to, let's say, a page maker. Some people are already used to Photoshop. Some people are already used to a different tool. And generally asking them to switch that tool is like very, very hard because they have done that for 5 years to 10 years. And it's not really easy to change that habit.
Right.
So what we are doing right now, at least, is that we are basically saying that like you can create your comics wherever you want. And like we don't hold any restrictions in terms of that it has to be in this format or it has to be basically built on this tool or technology or whatever. In the beginning, let us try and solve for distribution. Let us try and give you more and more readers and more of an audience, people who really like your work, who engage with that work, who follow you for your future works and things like that. And then in parallel, we'll try and figure out what is the best way to kind of enable these creators, where if you are just a comic artist or illustrator and you want to have access to a great story that you can design, then we will try and figure out to build that match in between, and vice versa. So if you are a great letterer, or if you're good at inking, but you need an illustrator and a story writer, we'll try and figure out a way to kind of bring these people together. But for now, what we are doing, essentially, as I said, is just to solve engagement and audience for these people, and not on the creation side.
No, I love it. I think distribution is always the first thing that sort of needs to be solved. I think in a way, in most businesses, distribution.
I think distribution is the hardest thing to solve. If you solve for distribution, then like people generally figure out everything else on their own.
Right.
Even if you don't. Of course, that doesn't mean you shouldn't. It's just that if you solve for distribution, rest of the things kind of take care of themselves.
No, for sure. I mean, that's not to say that distribution is everything. We have the entire body of work that is on our TV screens right now, which is simply because distribution has been figured out very easily, but everybody forgot to figure out everything else. That's just my take. Let me ask you my second follow-up on comics, right? And this is something that's kind of quite close to my heart as well, right? And I've had massive discussions about this with Samir Saxena or a bunch of people who are also equally passionate about comics, right? I think there is a groundswell of at least young Indian men who have grown up with these comics, right? Nagaraj, Super Commando Dhruv, Doga, Chacha Chaudhary, whatever, all of those guys, right? And then there is the grown-up comics tradition where we will go and watch Wonder Woman or Avengers, and there is nothing in between, right? For a guy like you or for a guy like me, the cultural artifacts and the cultural capital of comics in India have been very poorly represented in our current cultural consumption, right? And I'm not saying Bhavesh Joshi superhero counts. Bhavesh Joshi superhero doesn't count, right? Like it's not a sort of canon comic that we're talking about here. What's your take on this? And how do you think, I mean, is there a way that Pratilipi can help change this a little bit? Because here's what I'm excited about, right? I'd love to see Anurag Kashyap make a Nagaraj movie, for example, right? Or I would love to see Pratilipi put out a podcast documenting the details of how great Indian comics were made. But there's very little there. How do you, I mean, as both as a company founder and as a comics enthusiast, look at this, right?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. In fact, so I have been a huge fan of Dhruv as a character, comic character. I would probably argue that I am a bigger fan of Dhruv than any of the other characters in English or any other language.
Right.
It's one of those superheroes, similar to, I think, Batman to some extent, who is almost entirely doing things without any superpower, except for his brains, of course, and resourcefulness. I think what has happened in India has been that people have generally taken a fairly short-term view of monetization and revenue and profit and things like that.
Right.
So if you want to build a IP franchise, or if you want to build a actual legacy in anything, then you generally have to take a very, very long-term view of things. You have to kind of invest into things a little ahead of time. That is what I think if you look at Disney in particular, they have done really, really well.
Right.
So some parts of Disney don't really make money or they lose money or whatever. It's just that the sum of all the parts, it's actually much bigger than what these individual parts would be. So when a new Iron movie comes out, for example, it's not just about that movie. It's basically the entire brand of Iron Man kind of increases its value.
Right.
So more comics are sold, more merchandise are sold, more people go to theme park to watch Iron Man, and so on and so forth. So I definitely think that as India moves from a country where the GDP per capita was very, very low and people were really worried about just how to put a meal on their table, to a world where people like me and you, we actually at least don't have to worry about survival anymore, where we can make enough money to eat food on the table. We can take longer term horizons and bigger risk to actually build things that last for 50 years or 100 years.
Right.
Versus for my father's generation, for example, except for very few people who actually had enough money from their family, it was really, really hard to take big risks.
Right.
So I definitely think that irrespective of whether it is Pratilipi doing this or somebody else doing this, but I definitely think that within the next 10 to 15 years, we'll see the comic industry in India changing a lot. And we will have at least 1 or 2 or 3 characters or IPs that will actually be valuable in and of themselves.
Inshallah, that happens. And I hope they make Super Commando Dhruv first for your sake. But no, I completely agree, man. I think it will happen. It has to happen. We can't just be sitting around on great IPs and not doing anything about it. And the comparison is very clear, right? And just underlines what you just said, that you have to plan a little bit in advance. They could make 21 movies in 20 years or 18 years, simply because there was a vision to it and the people sat down and collaboration happened. And sure, we take longer to sort these things out, right? Our music rights is always in a little bit of a tizzy. Our comic book rights and planning and who's going to put money. All of these things are still being figured out, but I'm hopeful, man. I think it'll be a big loss if we continue to disregard the history of our comic book culture and not bring it out for younger generations to see, man. Because I highly doubt that young people are still, like I recently bought the entire back catalog of Raj Comics just because I had to have it. But again, a lot of it is in Hindi, a lot of it is not translated in multiple languages. There's so much that can't be done right now. And I think that impetus is something that will really take us forward from the comic side of things. What do you think?
If I may interrupt you, there are two things that I want to talk about. Yeah. So first is that it just reminded me when you basically said that you have the entire collection of Raj Comics. So when I started paying myself a salary at Pratilipi, the first thing that I did with my salary was basically buy a bunch of comics.
Right.
Literally. And I posted a photo on Facebook and Twitter that, your company finally is able to pay you. So what do? You kind of entertain the inner child in you, what you wanted to achieve when you were a young kid.
That's brilliant.
The second thing is that something that you were talking about earlier, and I somehow did not pick up on it at that time, which is the same Disney example. So if you look at Pratilipi Comics today, out of top 10 comics on Pratilipi Comics, both in terms of revenue and in terms of readership, 7 are actually based on stories that were already published on Pratilipi.
Right.
So now, in fact, some of these stories we are thinking of converting into physical comics books, as well as like audio podcast or show, you want to call it. So exactly what we were discussing earlier, that like at least the greatest stories need to be told in different formats, because different people will basically have different, and once it is kind of like done in different formats and different languages and different geographies, the value of the entire IP or the entire franchise. So that is something that we have already started seeing, and we are going to be doubling down on it very, very significantly in the coming year.
That's great, man. And let me double click on that for a second, because I think apart from the marketplace and the product and the people that you've generated, the largest value or the most disproportionate value that can be created with Pratilipi is through these IPs, right? Are you looking at that as a strategic sort of wing going forward? What's been the progress on that like, right? Are there some success stories that you already have that are really working for you? And what's the vision on that side of things, right?
Yeah, so long term, I think that is the real value of Pratilipi. So different products will be monetized in different ways. So for example, the way IVM monetizes is very different from the way Pratilipi Comics monetizes. And the way literature is going to be monetized is going to be different from both of these. But like what builds all of these things together to basically form Pratilipi is basic understanding is that once we figure out a great story, it would be told and retold in multiple different formats and multiple different languages over a period of time. So like the biggest example is something that I already gave you, that 7 out of top 10 comics. Mm-hmm. And this is including all the comics that we have licensed from the biggies like Diamond Comics and Amar Chitragatha and Tapurth and all of those. Including all of those, 7 of the stories are still stories published on Pratilipi. Similarly, over a period of time, some of those stories will be converted into physical books. Some of these, in fact, some are already under production that will be covered into physical books. But some of these books or stories will also be converted into web series or TV series or movies or games or merchandise or theme parks or something else. So in fact, that is what is going to be our biggest focus over the next 5 to 10 years.
No, that sounds very inspiring, very much like Disney, and I hope all of that comes alive for you. Let me ask you this, to take this a little bit forward, right? We also talked about Pratilipi's focus on audio, and the recent sort of acquisition of IVM, that sort of bolstered that stream of entertainment and content for you as well. I'd love to know how you see the audio space growing, right? There's a lot of optimism about it. I think podcasts serve a definite need that Indian audiences don't get, which is radio or audio only or talk radio. But I'd love to know what your take on it is from a short, medium, long-term perspective.
So to be honest, my understanding is that as far as India is concerned, audio is still a very, very nascent market. We don't really have enough demand right now. Having said that, I also believe that in long term, audio is going to be a very, very big part of how we kind of share our thoughts with each other
Right.
in form of stories, in form of conversations, in form of shows and everything else. So I think different formats are like relevant or important for different kind of use cases, and which is why like we have always said that we want to enable storytelling across formats,
Right.
apart from across genres and languages or geography. So I think one of the things which makes audio better than everything else is just the way that you can parallel task. You simply cannot parallel task while you are reading,
Right.
and it's also impossibly hard to parallel task with video.
Right.
It's possible, but not really most convenient. With audio, you can have true parallel tasking. Then there are certain use cases where audio is just a better experience because it's easier to kind of create on a relative basis. And then you can have background sounds and stuff like that. So we believe that audio is going to be really, really big part of how we create and consume content. It's just that we don't know if that is going to happen in a year or if it's going to happen in 5 years. Our thesis broadly here is that we again will kind of make sure that we are there as both a company, but also as an ecosystem in terms of what we do to grow the entire market itself. And then whenever that demand kind of catches up, everybody basically benefits from that. Which is why as part of IVM as well, for example, it's not just that we are trying to grow IVM, we of course are, but like equally importantly, even as part of IVM, we have been trying to grow the ecosystem as well.
Right.
So we are trying to build like people who are already creating podcasts or shows which are not a part of IVM. We are trying to bring them under IVM umbrella so that we can give them more audience as well as higher revenue. So this has been the way Pratilipi has worked in general as well, not just what is good for one company or one product, but also what is good for the ecosystem. So at least that is our approach as far as audio is concerned.
Fantastic. I hope to be part of that approach, growing
Absolutely.
bigger and bigger. And then I can quit my job and just be a podcaster and do this full time, right? No, I'm joking. I love my job.
Well, hopefully at least you would have that choice where you make enough money from podcasts where you don't have to do it. If you want to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the dream, to be very honest, right? In my 20s, I got myself a great job and did some cool things. In my 30s, I want to quit that job and be a podcaster. That's the dream. But let me ask you this. And this is something that I'd love to sort of get a holistic picture from you on, right? Monetization of content and is generally a problem area in India. The reason I say it, and again, my vast experience on video, now with audio, with brands as well. Content monetization is still being figured out. There are lots of players in the market who are offering really cheap rates or creating really bad content and just sucking away money from the market, right? And on the other hand, there are, better content creators out there who are not being able to produce what they want to produce because of monetization. How does Pratilipi figure in this scheme of things? How do you monetize yourself currently? And what's the vision for you to monetize for the creators who are working with you?
So I'll start with talking a little bit about the ecosystem as a whole, and then I'll get to Pratilipi and what we are doing right now and how we think this will evolve in future. When we look at the ecosystem as a whole, you have to understand that at the end of the day, market needs enough liquidity before you can really monetize well. So attention basically will always be a leading indicator of monetization, not the other way around.
Right.
So when we started building Pratilipi, for example, even for US, people used to say that digital and especially mobile is absolutely great for consumption, but there is no monetization on mobile. And that seemed true at the time.
Right.
But if you look at it today, in US, digital advertising on mobile is actually now bigger than like almost any other single stream of advertising.
Right.
This is bigger than TV advertising. This is bigger than radio advertising and everything else. But that takes time before you have enough liquidity. So I believe that in India as well, the same story will happen. It's just that whether that will happen in 6 months or 6 years is hard to say. My best guess is that it's probably going to take like 4 to 5 years before the content monetization is bigger than the TV monetization, but it will happen. It might take longer or shorter, but it will happen. But for that to happen, as I was saying, there has to be enough liquidity. By that, what I mean is that there has to be enough high quality content, and there has to be people who have consumed that content enough number of times. So before Amazon Kindle was launched, for example, it seemed like ebooks had no future. And it's not that Amazon Kindle was the first product to come in the market. It's just that nobody else subsidized it for long enough where people had experienced that multiple enough times where they would be ready to pay for it. And because Amazon kind of did that, So ebook sales increased within US as well as globally, not just for Amazon, but for other people as well.
Right.
So I believe that in content, both for audio and text and video and everything else, the same will happen in India. It's just that we as an ecosystem have to get to that liquidity point. And which is why I think the more companies trying this out, the better it is. Even if you don't think their content is of high quality, it at least exposes people to that kind of content, that format of content. So I absolutely love that Hotstar and Prime and Netflix and YouTube and Daily Hunt and ShareChat and all of these companies are doing such a phenomenal work in giving exposure to more people in the form of digital content of different types and sizes and formats and quality and all of that. So that's in general.
Right.
Now coming to Pratilipi in more specifically. As I was saying earlier, different products will have different monetization.
Right.
So I already told about literature that the way we are thinking about it is basically that readers can subscribe to their favorite writers as a show of support, and they get access to certain extra features and certain extra content. But majority of content will still remain free, by the way. It will just be a small percentage of content that's exclusive. Or they can basically tip these writers via virtual gifts as a show of their support and appreciation. For Pratilipi Comics, the way it's monetized right now is essentially that every week a new chapter is released for a comics.
Right.
And you can wait for the next week to read that chapter for free. Or if you want to read it today itself, then you can basically pay a small amount of money and read the chapter that everybody else is going to read next week today.
So like a early access TVOD model sort of, yeah.
Exactly. So that is for comics. For IVM, the way we currently monetize is via brand advertisement.
Right.
So because IVM's content is some of the highest, if not the highest quality audio content that we have in India right now.
Thank you so much.
So a lot of brands obviously want to kind of reach out to this audience while knowing that the content that they are listening to is some of the highest quality content.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the IP licensing that we talked about, which kind of connects all these parts together. So we have licensed a few, for example, audiobooks to Storytel. We have licensed a web series to a player. It's not yet announced, so I can't really tell you the name.
Sure.
We have licensed 100 stories for physical books to a publisher. So a lot of these licensing deals kind of bring in some other revenue. Over a period of time, like we will launch multiple other products. And again, different products will have different monetization depending on the use case. But the IP is what will kind of bind all of these things together.
Sure. And if I were to just ask you, and you don't have to answer it, but what sort of the distribution of revenue that you see in these 3 or 4 streams? Like what's really working well? Like is licensing, and again, licensing is sort of more lucrative often, sometimes less. But I just love to know what sort of balance or split you're seeing here.
The honest answer is like it's still way too early to be able to kind of say anything with any kind of real certainty.
Sure.
But I can tell you what I think.
Yeah, from a potential perspective, I'd love to know.
So I think for the first 1 or 2 years, or maybe even 3 or 4 years, the product monetization will probably be like the biggest stream of revenue.
Sure.
So like in IVM's case, for example, brand advertising or early access in the terms of comics, or subscription in the terms of literature product. So in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, we believe that product monetization will be the biggest piece of the pie, and it might even be 70-80% of our total revenue. But as we look further into the future, then IP licensing will continue to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So as of now, IP should probably be like 10% of revenue.
Sure.
I think 3 years out, it should probably be 30-40% of our revenue.
Sure.
I think 10 years out, IP should probably be 90% of our revenue.
Right. I think that sets you up very nicely for like a entire value chain, right? In creation. I think that vision is that the sort of vision that you're also building towards, where 10 years down the line, you've got such great content, such great writers, a full network, so to speak, that Pratilipi becomes the Yash Raj of native content, or maybe the Disney. Is that the vision?
A little more than that, to be fair.
Sure.
So the way we think about it is that if Pratilipi is successful, we will be the modern version of it.
Right.
In Disney's case, Disney is one of my favorite companies, by the way, so it's meant as a compliment. That Disney, what they have done better than anybody else in the world is that they have access to 1,000 great creators.
Right.
And they have taken their stories and kind of licensed them often on their own and sometimes via others, basically build a media media empire.
Yeah.
Now, our understanding is what if instead of having 1,000 great storytellers, we can create 1 million great storytellers.
Right.
So that was impossible in the physical world because of the cost of distribution. But in the world of internet, cost of marginal distribution is very close to zero.
Right.
So essentially, it's actually possible for us to have 1 million great storytellers. the goal or the vision essentially is to build the modern version of Disney as against just the Indian Disney or something.
And all the best for that. I think you're already putting in such a great effort to formalize a market or a segment of the market that hasn't been done before. I think you're well on your way to do that. Let me pivot this away from Pratilipi for a bit in sort of our last segment and talk about you. You're a voracious reader. That's something that I found very interesting from hearing you talk. And again, I thought of myself as a voracious reader. Then I heard somewhere that you read 130 books in a year. And I was like, no, I'm not a voracious reader. That guy's a voracious reader. Tell us about that, man. How's that become such an important part of your life? Now you're working in literature. Tell us about your journey as a reader.
Yeah, so I think for me, reading was always essentially my escape mechanism.
Right.
So, anything that I don't like in my life or anything, if I'm going through a difficult situation or anything, I think reading kind of takes me to a different world.
Right.
So in fact, that is how Pratilipi was named Pratilipi, because I think George R. R. Martin captured it very well. R. R. Martin is the author of Game of Thrones.
Right.
And he basically said that a normal person lives one life. A reader lives 100 lives via the eyes of the protagonist of the stories that they are reading.
Right.
Because if you are really reading a story and really liking it, you will basically put yourself into that protagonist's shoes.
Absolutely.
Like the number of people who wanted to go to Hogwarts after reading Harry Potter, I think it's going to be insane. So that is how I kind of got attracted to reading, and that's how it still is. So unlike other people, for example, I read because I enjoy reading. I don't read because it's a hobby or because I'm supposed to read 5 books or whatever. It's mostly if I like something, I read it. If I like it too much, I reread it. If I don't like it, I don't read it.
Right.
So for me, reading has been like just something that I enjoy. And it's a byproduct of reading that, you know, you learn some things and you have more perspectives and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
But that's not why I read. I read because I find it fun.
That's awesome. Tell us about some of your favorite authors, man.
That's actually a harder question to answer. But I think in Indian authors, I've been a big fan of Nirala and Premchand. So Nirala, I think, has been possibly the most underrated writer in the world and definitely in India. But and obviously, unfortunately for people like us, his poetry kind of uses a little bit of complicated words, which are probably not that complicated for somebody who understands Sanskrit.
Right.
But for people like me and you, they are sometimes complicated. But the emotions that his poetry captures is absolutely brilliant. And then, of course, Premchand, I think, has been absolutely phenomenal in the way that his stories kind of transcend time. What he wrote in let's say 1940s is still applicable in Indian villages, and that is probably the best, literally probably the best proof of just how good a writer he was.
Right.
Globally, I have been a big fan of Mario Puzo, who wrote the Godfather series. But even more than Godfather, I absolutely loved his next book called Sicilian.
Right. And Omerta after that.
Yeah. So I think these would probably be some of my top picks.
That's lovely, man. It's a good spread as well. Any contemporary writers that you've been reading?
So to be honest, nowadays I read a lot more non-fiction than fiction.
Right.
And vast majority of that would be essays or reports or market summaries and stuff like that. A lot less of fiction. But I think I can talk about again some stories that I have really liked, instead of talking about writers per se. So on Pratilipi, there is a story called Meri Avantika. It's a love and romance story, like a typical Bollywood story, but I think I loved reading that. There's a writer called Shivmurthy, which I think is possibly the best writer that I've read who is still alive. He has published multiple stories on Pratilipi, including a story called Kuchi Ka Kanun. So I think 30-40 years back, there was a movie made on his story as well.
Right.
But I think Shivmurthy in general and Kuchi Ka Kanun in particular is absolutely brilliant. I think these would be the ones that I can think of the top of my head.
Brilliant, man. I'd urge my listeners to go and check out those stories, because obviously if it's something that's coming from someone who reads 130 books a year, you must check it out.
Yeah, I think in fact for your listeners, if they read Hindi, I think Shivmurthy might be the greatest writer that they have read who is still alive.
That's Shivmurthy. My last question is sort of connected to what I just asked you as well. But before that, let me thank you for your time. I think it's been a fascinating conversation going through the history of Pratilipi with you, and just meeting you, man. It's just such a positive vibe that comes from someone who's so committed to doing something interesting, something that's so deeply personal to you as well. That's what it seems like, right? Before I let you go, there's this question that we ask everyone who's on the show is to give out some entertainment recommendations to my listeners. You already gave us a couple of them from stories, but I'll twist that conversation a little bit, or that question a little bit for you, and ask you for recommendations of 4 or 5 best authors that you have on the Pratilipi platform that people must check out.
I think there's a writer called Nitin Mishra, and some of his stories I think are fabulous. If you are interested in, generally suspense and thriller, the Nitin has also kind of illustrated some comics for Raj Comics, by the way.
Right.
So I think that would probably be great. Mary Avantika, the writer's name is Abhida Sharma, one of the most widely read writers on Pratilipi, and I think you would like that. There's another writer called Varsha Srivastava, and some of her stories are going to be converted into web series very, very soon.
Oh, wow.
So I think Varsha would probably be another writer that people might like reading. And the last one has to be Shivamurthy. I can't think of somebody who would be better than that. And his stories are more social and little slow moving, like Premchand, but also stories that I think will stand the test of time.
That's a great list. I'm going to check out some of them definitely very, very quickly. Ranjeet, it's been, like I said, an absolute pleasure talking to you and getting to know Pratilipi a little bit better. It's a company that obviously I've tracked for a very long time, and I'm super impressed by the kind of stuff that you guys are putting together. I hope you had fun talking to me.
Of course, thanks a lot for having me here. And it was good to kind of not just go into the regular question, but talk about some new and interesting things. So thanks a lot for having me here.
Hey, thanks for making time. And that's it on this episode of Storytellers and Story Sellers. This is Vineet Kanabar saying goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Storytel and The Whole Truth Foods. Thank you for supporting us. We have a new show out this week, Candid Kannan with Siddharth Kannan. Sid K is a well-known RJ. He has an incredible show with some of the most amazing Bollywood celebrities. As part of the first week's episode, we're releasing 5 episodes at one time, so you can get your fill of Sid. You can hear him talk to Varun Dhawan, Anil Kapoor, Anurag Kashyap, Bhumi Pednekar, and a whole lot more. This week on the Edges and Sledges podcast with Varun DJ and Ashwin, hear them talk about the historic victory that India achieved at Gaba. Maruk Inayat had an amazing talk with Gul Panag. They spoke about the farmer protests and why Bollywood celebs are acting the way that they are. And finally, Shunya 1 is back this week. Shiladitya and me talked to Anirudh Singla from Pepper Content. We have a great lineup of guests coming up in the coming weeks, including Deepak Abid, the co-founder of India Gold. Definitely check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.